Thank you so much for your time on eNCA this evening. Do you have enough insight, financial literacy, and the understanding of governance processes? I want to clear that before we talk, because the Public Enterprises Minister believes some of you analysts just don't get it. You are just fabricating false ideas about SAA.
Look, apparently only the Public Enterprises Minister has the type of financial insight and the financial literacy that is necessary to understand what is at stake here. That is his view. The problem, of course, with a view of that nature is that it gives the impression that everybody else who has an opinion about how state funds are being deployed, that view doesn't matter for as long as it is not in line with what the ANC government wants to say. That, of course, is completely a false premise, because at the end of the day, the ANC government can only deploy the funds that are given to it by the public. So the public has got the right to comment on what happens when public funds are to be deployed. So the finance minister discrediting or undermining other people's insights is good for him, but that's not going to stop us from querying the merit and perhaps the wisdom of deploying more funds into an entity like SAA.
Do you buy this explanation that the Public Enterprises Department has given us, Khaya, that the 10.5 billion rand is not really a bailout of SAA, but rather the funds will be used to meet the obligations of the business rescue process, which government has to meet?
No, the important thing about all other bailouts is that the Public Enterprises Minister has never gone out to say, well, for this particular bailout, this is the purpose. The whole idea of a bailout is that if a state-owned enterprise comes to the state and says, look, we've ran into some financial difficulties, we need you to put an injection that you're not going to get a particular return on, that's what a bailout is. Now, to then imagine that we now have to then go and interrogate what the money gets used for and then come back and say, well, this is a bailout or this isn't a bailout, this is him simply shifting the goalposts. So if this is going to be how we do things going forward, well, then we must apply that logic across all other bailouts that state-owned enterprises do come up with. So I think the problem here is that they had said that they were never going to do another bailout. They've just done one. So for him to then pretend that it isn't by simply engaging in a game of semantics and playing around with the English doesn't take away from the fact that it's a bailout. The state has given 10.5 billion rand with zero prospect of ever getting any amount of it back. It is a bailout.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, this is money taken from other departments, used to save an airline that's been failing dismally over the years and failed to make profit since 2013 and has quite frankly been in the skies because of the billions in taxpayers' money that was used to bail it out. Given that context that you've also outlined and the current realities of the global aviation industry, does it make sense that the business rescue practitioners put together this plan that shows some hope for SAA?
No, at the end of the day, remember the business rescue plan that was put together was essentially a template of hope. And even in that template of hope, they said over the next 3 years, you probably still not going to return to profitability, given the projections that they put together at the time that they put that business rescue plan. Well, guess what? Since then, the entire global aviation sector has been decimated by the effect of the coronavirus pandemic. So their best intentions notwithstanding, everything that became an input when they did come up with a plan that a lot of us agree is quite nonsensical to begin with, everything that they put together as inputs into the plan way back when they tabled it to the finance minister and the public enterprises minister, all of those things have changed. And unfortunately, when they've changed, they've gone in the wrong direction in relation to SAA. We now know that the current volumes that we saw in 2019 in relation to passenger volumes, for example, it's going to take the next 4 years for those to be restored, according to OUTA. So if the entire global value chain is going to take 4 years to recover, you can imagine what happens to an airline that was struggling even during the good times. And of course, that is SAA. So the idea that just because the ANC wishes for things to happen means that the economics and, logic is going to gravitate towards that, that's not how it works, in spite of what the Minister of Public Enterprises wishes.
Well, government argues, Khaya, that the failure to allocate the funds to see through this business rescue process would have resulted in the liquidation of the airline at the cost of more than 18 billion rand, and that would have disadvantaged SAA employees, especially even in terms of their severance packages.
Well, I think the premise for that is that they seem to be trying to make us believe that by putting the 10.5 billion rand, they've actually saved the jobs of SAA employees. No, they haven't. All they've done is find a way to actually fund the severance packages and the training layoff scheme that they're putting together. At the end of the day, once we then have to start running the airline, which they predict is going to happen in January 2021, this needs to stand alone as a business. This needs to be viable as a business. And unfortunately, history indicates that for as long as government treats the airline the way it's done before, this business is never going to become viable. So them coming up with these alternative numbers to say that if we don't do this, then there's another 18.5 billion rand. My answer to you is that we spend 10.5 billion rand now, but in a year or 2 years' time, we're going to have to put another bailout that's actually going to get us back to the liquidation value that we've just avoided now. So we've been down this road before, and just because the Minister of Public Enterprises doesn't like facts doesn't mean that the facts do not exist.
Well, they will argue that there are private partners that are interested in buying a stake in what would then be the new airline. So that's going to then put government at ease, because then it doesn't have to feel obliged to bail out this new airline, because there would be these private partners that are helping run it and are also putting in some money.
No, that is also a nonsensical premise. At the end of the day, if there is a private sector player who believes that SAA can be rescued and can be run as a viable business, that private sector player needs to really go and revisit how they do their business projections. It is impossible to imagine that an airline that was struggling during the good times in the aviation sector is suddenly going to emerge and rise as a phoenix when the entire sector itself is saying that for the next 3 or 4 years, it's actually going to be going through its worst times. So unfortunately, just because the Department of Public Enterprises puts something on paper and puts it in a government letterhead doesn't elevate it into a factual reality. It's still very unlikely that the aviation sector is going to recover anytime soon. And for as long as government insists that it knows how to run an airline when evidence indicates that it cannot do so, then of course that private sector player that decides to partner with government will be taking the type of gamble that I just think makes no economic sense at this stage.
I want us to talk about the finance minister now. Part of his job at Treasury is to manage expectations of other ministers. We know his views about SAA. He said it must be closed down. That was in 2018. Even in Parliament today, when he was asked about the airline, he explained how he understands the new airline would be run. And then he said, and I quote, "Whether we need a new airline, that's not my lane. I've been told to stay in my lane." End quote. What does that communicate to us?
To correct you, he actually didn't illustrate an understanding of knowing how the new airline is going to work. In fact, he was even still speculating that he thinks that perhaps its shareholding structure is going to look like how Telkom has been structured. The great problem here is that if the finance minister of a country who's signing off the checks of up to 10 billion rand himself doesn't actually know what it is that he's investing in, it tells you the type of governance crisis that we have at the highest positions of leadership in South Africa. It is completely inconceivable that a finance minister can say in Parliament the day after he makes this particular commitment that he actually still doesn't even know what it is that he's asking us to invest in. This idea that he can stay in his lane, well, his lane is where the money is. The Department of Public Enterprises cannot finance any of its vanity projects. That's the reality. The finance minister is the one that has to do so. And for him to simply say, well, I know that I've been asked to do it, but I don't know what it is that I've been asked to do, is actually him reminding us that he's always been opposed to the idea of rescuing SAA because it knows it cannot be viable given the way the government thinks it knows how to run an airline when the evidence indicates that it doesn't.
So he could have then resisted the temptation to put more money into SAA, like he has been resisting, well, some have argued for some time now. And that, I suppose, would have meant he's the man of his word. Did he now yield to pressure, and what does that say about his role at Treasury?
Well, he definitely capitulated, but if you saw his tweets yesterday, he's denying the fact that he capitulated, and he's now of the opinion that it's a government decision, so therefore capitulation doesn't exist. But of course, that's completely inaccurate. What he did is that he took a particular position. As far back as 2 years ago, he was very adamant that this thing cannot be rescued in its current form, so that's always been his particular position, and we know that he has resisted, even when the business rescue process started, when people were asking him to sign the type of guarantees that will enable the business rescue team to proceed. He was resisting on that. So the fact that he then stood up in Parliament yesterday and said something else means he has capitulated. And again, the fact that government ministers do not like facts doesn't mean that the facts do not exist. Tito Mboweni had a position about SAA and has now been forced into a U-turn. That is the definition of capitulation. He doesn't have to like it. That's what it is.
Yeah, Khaya Sithole, thank you so much for your frank and brutal analysis on eNCA this evening. That's political analyst Khaya Sithole.